The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at work, sitting at my desk, staring at my computer screen, when my phone buzzed. I almost didn't answer it. I almost ignored the call, like I'd learned to do over the past 3 years. But something made me pick up. Some instinct. Some terrible intuition that told me this call was going to change everything. "Hello?" I said cautiously. "You think you can keep my son from me?" His voice came through the speaker like a threat, like a promise of destruction. "You think you can poison him against me? You think you can take him away and I'm just going to let it happen?" My blood ran cold. My hands started shaking. I knew that voice so well. I'd heard it angry thousands of times. I'd heard it cruel. I'd heard it full of rage and contempt. But this was different. This was something darker. "James," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady, "I'm not keeping your son from you. You have visitation every other weekend. You know that." "Not anymore," he said. His voice was calm now, almost cheerful, which was somehow worse than when he was yelling. "I've hired a lawyer, the best lawyer in this city, and I'm coming for full custody. And when I'm done with you in that courtroom, you're going to wish you'd never met me." The line went dead. I sat there at my desk, my phone still in my hand, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my chest. My coworkers were walking past me, typing on their keyboards, living their normal lives. Nobody noticed that my entire world had just crumbled. That was 4 months ago. My name is Rachel, and I'm about to tell you a story that will shake you. A story about love turned toxic. About a man who promised to protect me and instead became my greatest nightmare. About a woman who had to become stronger than she ever thought possible just to keep her child safe. But more than that, it's a story about what happens when you finally decide that enough is enough. When I met James, I was 23 years old. I was working as a graphic designer at a small marketing firm. I was independent. I was confident. I was happy. And then he walked into my life like a hurricane, and everything changed. He was charming. He was successful. He was everything I thought I wanted. He owned his own consulting business. He drove a nice car. He wore expensive suits. He made me feel like I was special, like I was the most important person in the world. When he asked me to move in with him after 6 months of dating, I said yes without hesitation. When he proposed after a year, I cried happy tears. When I got pregnant, we were both thrilled. We were going to be a family. Our son, Marcus, was born on a cold February morning. He was perfect. He was beautiful. He was the best thing that had ever happened to me. I thought James would be a wonderful father. I thought we were going to have the life we'd always dreamed of. I was wrong. It started small. Criticism about how I dressed, comments about how I spent money, complaints about how I cooked or cleaned or raised Marcus. The words were never kind, but I convinced myself that he was just stressed, that he was adjusting to being a father, that this was normal. But it wasn't normal. Nothing about it was normal. It escalated to yelling. He'd yell at me in front of Marcus. He'd tell me I was stupid, worthless, a bad mother, a bad wife. He'd scream about how I was ruining his life, how I was holding him back, how he'd be so much better off without me. And then came the worst part. The physical abuse started on a Tuesday evening. We were fighting about something stupid. I can't even remember what now. And he pushed me. I fell into the kitchen counter. I had a bruise the size of his hand on my arm. He cried. He apologized. He said it would never happen again. He promised he loved me. He promised he was sorry. And I believed him. Because I wanted to believe him. Because I had a son who needed his father. Because I was terrified of what would happen if I tried to leave. So I stayed. I made excuses for the bruises. I wore long sleeves even in summer. I told people I was clumsy. I lied to my mother. I lied to my friends. I lied to myself. For 3 years, I lived with James. 3 years of walking on eggshells. 3 years of trying to be the perfect wife so he wouldn't get angry. 3 years of violence and cruelty and degradation. 3 years of feeling like I was dying inside while pretending to the world that everything was fine. And the worst part was watching what it did to Marcus. My beautiful, innocent son watching his father treat his mother like she was nothing. Watching violence. Learning that this was what relationships looked like. Learning that love was supposed to hurt. Finally, on a Thursday morning, I woke up and I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't pretend. I couldn't stay. I packed a bag while James was in the shower. I took Marcus to my mother's house, and I told James that I was done, that I wanted a divorce, that I was leaving him. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He just smiled, and he said, "Go ahead, leave. But when this is over, I'm taking Marcus, and you're never going to see him again. I have money. I have connections. I have the best lawyer in this city on speed dial. And you? You're nobody. You're a crazy, unstable woman who can't even keep herself together. The judge is going to look at you and laugh, and you're going to lose everything." That was when the real nightmare began. Let me go back. Let me tell you what those 3 years were really like. Because if I'm going to make you understand how terrifying this threat was, you need to understand what I'd already survived. When I first moved in with James, I noticed small things, the way he'd comment on my appearance. "You'd look so much better if you lost a few pounds. That outfit makes you look fat. Why do you always have to make yourself look so cheap?" I'd laugh it off. I'd tell myself he was just joking. But inside, something started to chip away at my confidence. I started dressing differently. I started avoiding the mirror. I started believing what he was saying about me. Then came the isolation. He didn't like my friends. He said they were bad influences. He said they didn't respect him. He said I was spending too much time with them and not enough time with him. So gradually, I stopped calling them. I stopped going out. I stopped having a life outside of James. My mother was next. He said she was undermining our marriage. He said she was jealous of him. He said she was trying to turn me against him. He convinced me that she didn't have my best interests at heart, that she was just trying to control me. So I created distance from her too. I didn't call as often. I made excuses not to visit. I let him come between me and my own mother. When Marcus was born, I thought things would change. I thought becoming a father would soften James. I thought he'd see how beautiful life could be with our son. Instead, he became more controlling. He monitored what I fed Marcus. He told me I was doing it wrong. He said I was too soft with him, that I was raising a weak child. He'd criticize every parenting decision I made, and when I tried to defend myself, he'd say I was being defensive, that I was overreacting, that I was crazy. The physical abuse started small, like I said. That first push. I convinced myself it was a one-time thing, an accident, something he'd never do again. But it happened again, and again, and again. He'd push me into walls. He'd grab my wrists so hard they'd bruise. He'd slap my face. He'd pull my hair. Each time he'd cry and apologize. Each time he'd swear it would never happen again. Each time I'd believe him, because what other choice did I have? I was trapped. I had no job anymore. He'd convinced me to quit so I could stay home with Marcus. I had no money of my own. I had no independence. I was completely dependent on him for everything, and he knew it. He'd remind me of it constantly. "If you ever leave me, I'll take Marcus. I have the money. I have the lawyers. You have nothing. You'll never see him again. I'll tell everyone you're crazy. I'll tell them you're an unfit mother. Nobody will believe you. Nobody will help you." So I stayed. I endured. I survived. But I started documenting everything, not consciously at first, just instinctively. Something in me knew that I might need proof someday, so I started writing things down. Every incident, every bruise, every cruel word, every threat. I wrote down dates, times, what happened, what he said, how it made me feel. I wrote about the violence. I wrote about the isolation. I wrote about the fear. I wrote about what it was doing to Marcus. I filled notebooks, page after page, Week after week, month after month, year after year. I never told anyone about them. Not my mother, not my friends, not my therapist. I kept them hidden in a locked box under my bed, buried under old clothes. That documentation was my insurance policy, my safety net, my proof that I wasn't crazy, that this was really happening. I didn't know how I'd ever use them. I just knew I needed them. Some part of me was planning for escape, even though the rest of me was too terrified to admit it. And then came the day when I finally broke. The day when I couldn't pretend anymore. Marcus was 7 years old. He was supposed to be at soccer practice, but he'd gotten sick at school. The teacher called me. James was in a meeting, so I had to pick Marcus up. When I got home, I found James in the kitchen, drinking a beer at 3 in the afternoon. "Why is he home?" he demanded. "He's sick," I said. "The school called. He has a fever." James looked at Marcus like he was angry at him for being ill, like this was a personal offense. "Go to your room," he told Marcus. Marcus went upstairs, scared. I could see the fear in his eyes, fear of his own father. And something in me snapped. "Don't talk to him like that," I said. My voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. Steel I didn't know I had. James looked at me like I'd slapped him. "What did you just say to me?" I said, "Don't talk to him like that. He's sick, he's scared, and you're making it worse." James stood up. He moved toward me. His fist was clenched. I could see the rage in his eyes. And I realized that this was it. This was the moment. Either I was going to let him hit me again and continue this cycle forever, or I was going to leave. So I did something I'd never done before. I stood my ground. "If you touch me," I said, my voice shaking but steady, "I'm leaving, and I'm taking Marcus with me, and you'll never see either of us again." He laughed. It was a horrible sound, a sound full of contempt. "You think you can take my son from me?" he said. "You think you have any power here? I'll destroy you. I'll take everything from you. You'll regret this." And then he walked out of the house. He didn't come home that night, or the next. By the end of the week, his lawyer had sent papers. He was filing for custody. He was demanding full custody and limited visitation for me. He was making good on his threat. And the phone call came. The one where he told me he was going to ruin me in court. That was the moment everything changed. After James hung up that day, I just sat at my desk for a long time. My coworkers came and went. People asked if I was okay. I nodded and said I was fine. But I wasn't fine. I was terrified. I was terrified that he would take Marcus away from me. I was terrified of what would happen in court. I was terrified that he was right, that I had no power, that nobody would believe me, that I was nothing. But then something shifted inside me. It was like a switch flipped, and I realized something important. He was right about one thing. I had no power in his world. I had no money, no connections, no prestigious job, no status. But I had something he didn't have. I had the truth, and I had documented that truth. For 3 years, I'd been writing down every single incident, every bruise, every cruel word, every threat, every moment of violence. It was all there, in my handwriting, on paper, dated and detailed. I went home that day, and I pulled out those notebooks. I spread them out on my bed, and I looked at them like I was seeing them for the first time. Page after page, thousands of words, hundreds of incidents, a complete record of a marriage falling apart, a complete record of abuse. And I realized something that shook me to my core. I had created evidence, without even meaning to, without even knowing it. I had been documenting my own case this whole time. I called a lawyer that night. Not James's fancy lawyer. A woman named Patricia Mills who specialized in domestic abuse cases. She was recommended by a domestic violence shelter I called. A woman who'd helped hundreds of women escape situations like mine. When I went to see her, I brought the notebooks with me. I sat in her office, across from a woman who was probably in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a kind expression, and I handed her those notebooks. She opened the first one. She started reading, and I watched her face as she realized what she was looking at. "These are detailed," she said quietly. "Very detailed." "I didn't know what else to do," I said. My voice was shaking. I just, I needed to remember. I needed to prove it was real. Because sometimes he'd deny things. He'd say they never happened. And I'd start to wonder if I was remembering correctly. If I was crazy. Patricia set the notebook down and looked at me directly in the eyes. "You are not crazy," she said. "You are one of the most organized and articulate victims of domestic abuse I've ever met. And you know what? These notebooks? They're going to save you. They're going to save your son." She started flipping through them page by page. She'd occasionally stop and look up at me with an expression that was hard to read. Shock, maybe. Anger. Sadness. "How long?" she asked. 3 years, I said. Every incident I could remember, sometimes multiple times a day. Patricia closed the notebook and leaned back in her chair. "Rachel," she said, "do you understand what you've done? Do you understand what this documentation means?" I shook my head. "This is everything we need," she said. "This is your case. This is how we win. This is how we not only keep your custody of Marcus, but how we prove that James is a danger to your son. How we show that he's unfit to have unsupervised visitation." For the first time in 3 years, I felt something that wasn't fear. I felt hope. Patricia told me what we were going to do. We were going to file a restraining order against James based on the physical abuse. We were going to fight for full custody. We were going to present these notebooks as evidence of a pattern of abuse and violence that proved James was a danger to me and to Marcus. "He threatened to take your son from you," Patricia said. "He threatened to ruin you in court. He's trying to intimidate you into silence. But guess what? You have a weapon. You have proof. And that changes everything." We spent hours in that office. Patricia asked me questions about the abuse, specific questions about incidents. She wanted me to tell her the stories behind the entries in my notebooks. She wanted context. She wanted to understand the full picture. I told her about the push into the counter, about the time he grabbed my arm so hard he left handprints, about the night he hit me across the face and I had to hide the bruise with makeup for a week. About the time he threatened to take Marcus if I didn't do exactly what he said. Each time I spoke, Patricia would make notes, and her expression would get more and more serious. "This is not just abuse," she said finally. "This is systematic, prolonged, documented abuse, and you have the evidence to prove it. James walked into court thinking he had all the power. He doesn't. You do." I left her office that day feeling different. For the first time since I'd met James, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I had a chance. But I also felt something else. Something I hadn't expected. I felt angry. Not the kind of anger that destroys you. The kind of anger that focuses you. That clarifies everything. That makes you understand what you have to fight for. I was fighting for Marcus. I was fighting for myself. And I was going to win. Over the next few weeks, Patricia and I prepared for court. We organized the notebooks chronologically. We typed up summaries of key incidents. We created a timeline that showed the progression of abuse from subtle to severe over 3 years. Patricia also gathered other evidence. She subpoenaed medical records from the one time I'd gone to the emergency room with a broken arm and told the doctor I'd fallen down the stairs. She knew I was lying, but the x-rays were still there. They still showed the fracture. She contacted the school and got Marcus's attendance records. There was a pattern of him being sick or having behavior problems on days after James had been particularly abusive. Teachers had noted that Marcus seemed anxious and scared. One teacher had actually written in a report that she was concerned about Marcus's home environment. Patricia had me go through photographs. She found pictures where my bruises were visible. Pictures where I was wearing long sleeves in summer. Pictures where I looked hollow and exhausted. She filed for a temporary restraining order while we prepared for the full custody hearing. And then something happened that I wasn't expecting. James escalated. He started leaving messages on my phone. Long, rambling voicemails where he'd tell me what he was going to do to me in court. How he'd make sure I never saw Marcus again. How he'd tell the judge that I was mentally unstable. How he'd claim that I'd poisoned Marcus against him. How he'd say I was denying him access to his son out of spite. Patricia told me to save every voicemail, every message, every threatening text, document everything, because his own words were becoming evidence against him. He also tried to interfere with my time with Marcus. He'd show up at school unannounced. He'd call Marcus repeatedly, trying to get him to say things against me. He'd tell Marcus that I was keeping him away, that I was the bad guy. It was cruel and calculated, and it backfired. Marcus started having nightmares. He started wetting the bed again, something he hadn't done since he was 4. He started asking me if he was a bad person because his father was being so mean. He was traumatized by his father's behavior, and all of that became part of the case. Patricia documented Marcus's emotional distress. She had Marcus see a child psychologist, who wrote a report saying that Marcus was displaying signs of parental alienation and emotional abuse. The psychologist recommended that James's unsupervised visitation be suspended pending a full evaluation of his fitness as a parent. James's lawyer filed a motion to dismiss the restraining order. He claimed that I was lying, that I was making everything up to keep Marcus from him, that I was the real abuser, alienating Marcus from his father. But then the hearing came, and Patricia presented the evidence. First, she presented the notebooks. She read passages directly from them. She presented them chronologically so you could see the pattern. Incident after incident. Abuse after abuse. A woman documenting her own nightmare as it was happening. The judge's expression changed as she listened. I could see it shift from skeptical to horrified. Then Patricia presented the medical records. The broken arm. The documentation from the emergency room that clearly showed trauma consistent with physical abuse. Then the school records. The pattern of Marcus's distress. The teacher's observations. Then the psychologist's report. Detailed documentation of Marcus's emotional trauma and his father's role in it. Then the voicemails. We played them in court. James's threatening voice filled the courtroom. His words, his threats, his contempt. James's lawyer tried to discredit everything. He said I was a liar. He said I'd fabricated the notebooks. He said I was making up the abuse. But you can't argue with documentation. You can't argue with medical records. You can't argue with a child's trauma. You can't argue with your own recorded voice threatening and terrorizing someone. The judge granted the temporary restraining order. She suspended James's unsupervised visitation pending a full custody evaluation. She ordered James to undergo a psychological evaluation to assess his fitness as a parent. When the gavel came down, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. But it wasn't over. This was just the beginning. James didn't take the temporary restraining order well. He became even more aggressive. He stopped paying child support. He violated the restraining order by showing up at my house. He sent emails filled with threats and insults. And his lawyer filed for a full custody hearing. He was going to try to overturn the restraining order. He was going to try to get full custody of Marcus. He was going to try to prove that I was the abuser, not him. Patricia told me to be prepared for the worst. She said that sometimes abusers will make allegations that mirror what they've done, flipping the narrative to make themselves the victim. And that's exactly what James did. In his filing, he claimed that I had been abusive to him. He said that I had isolated him from his family. He said that I had refused to let him see his son. He said that I had made up stories about abuse to keep him away. He claimed that I was mentally unstable, that I had a history of mental illness, that I was incapable of caring for Marcus properly. He said that the notebooks were fabrications, that I'd written them after the fact to create a false narrative. He painted a picture of himself as a loving father who'd been unfairly alienated from his son by a vengeful ex-partner. And he had his lawyer present all of this in a professional, polished way that almost sounded believable. But Patricia was ready, because we had prepared for exactly this. She had gathered letters from my therapist documenting the abuse. Not just my word. Professional testimony that I was not mentally unstable, that I was a victim of domestic abuse, that my accounts of the abuse were consistent and credible. She had gathered statements from neighbors who had heard James yelling at me, who had witnessed incidents, who had seen me with bruises. She had photographs, she had medical records, she had school records, she had the child psychologist's assessment, and most importantly, she had my notebooks. 200 pages of detailed chronological documentation of abuse, written contemporaneously with the events, in my handwriting, signed and dated. There's no way to argue with that. There's no way to claim it's fabricated. It's contemporaneous evidence of exactly what happened. Patricia also called witnesses. My mother testified about the changes she'd seen in me, about the bruises, about the isolation, about how my personality had changed from confident and happy to fearful and withdrawn. My former best friend testified about how James had isolated me from my social circle, how he'd convinced me to stop spending time with her, how she'd noticed I was being abused. Marcus's schoolteacher testified about his anxiety and his fear of his father. The child psychologist testified about the trauma he was observing in Marcus, about how the trauma was directly connected to James's behavior. But the most powerful testimony came when Marcus was allowed to speak to the judge. Not on the stand. Just in a private meeting with the judge, Patricia, and a court-appointed advocate. Marcus was 8 years old at that point. He was small and scared. But he told the judge the truth. He said his father scared him. He said his father yelled and was mean. He said his father had hurt his mother. He said he was scared his father was going to hurt him. He said he loved his father, but he was scared of him, and he wanted to stay with his mother. When the judge heard that, I saw something shift in her expression. She went from clinical to angry at James for what he'd done to his own son. The full custody hearing took place on a cold morning in November. I wore a black suit that Patricia had helped me pick out. It was important to look professional, to look like someone who should have custody of a child, to look competent and stable and trustworthy. James wore an expensive suit. He looked calm, composed, likable. He looked like a man who'd done nothing wrong. His lawyer started by painting him as a victim. She said he'd been unfairly accused. She said I was a vengeful ex-partner trying to keep him away from his son out of spite. She said the abuse allegations were exaggerated or fabricated. Then she presented her evidence. She had a psychologist who testified that there was no evidence of abuse in her professional opinion. She had a character witness who said James was a good man and a good father. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then it was Patricia's turn. She stood up and said, "Your Honor, I'm going to present evidence of a pattern of systematic, documented, prolonged domestic abuse. And I'm going to show you that this man is a danger to his ex-partner and to his son." She presented the notebooks first. She approached the judge's bench and handed over the 200 pages. She said, "These were written by Ms. Rachel over a 3-year period. They document every incident of physical and emotional abuse. They are detailed, specific, and contemporaneous with the events they describe." The judge took the notebooks and started reading. She read silently for several minutes while the entire courtroom sat in silence. Then she looked up at Patricia and said, "How many incidents are documented here?" 347, Patricia said. "Over 3 years. An average of more than 1 incident per day." The judge's face went pale. Then Patricia presented the medical records. The broken arm, the emergency room documentation, the doctor's notes about injuries consistent with abuse, then the school records, then the psychologist's evaluation of Marcus. Then she played the voicemails. In court, in front of James, in front of the judge. James's own voice, recorded, threatening, and cruel. I watched James's face as he listened to his own words. He tried to keep his expression neutral, but I could see the panic in his eyes. He knew what was happening. He knew he was losing. Then Patricia called me to testify. I sat in the witness box, and she asked me to tell the judge about my marriage to James, about the abuse, about why I documented everything. I told her about the push into the counter, about the time he grabbed my arm and left bruises, about the time he hit me in the face, about the threats, about the isolation, about living in fear every single day. And I cried. I didn't mean to. I tried to stay composed. But the emotions came anyway. The fear, the pain, the relief of finally being able to tell someone in a position of authority exactly what had happened to me. When Patricia asked me why I documented the abuse so carefully, I said, because I needed to remember that it was real. Because James would deny things, and I'd start to question myself. Because I was afraid he'd take my son away, and I needed proof. Because I knew someday I might need to show someone the truth. Then James's lawyer cross-examined me. She tried to make me look like a liar. She suggested that I'd fabricated the notebooks. She suggested that I was unstable. She suggested that I was making the whole thing up to keep Marcus away from his father. But there's no way to argue with contemporaneous documentation. There's no way to argue with medical records. There's no way to argue with a child's testimony about what they've witnessed. The lawyer tried anyway, but her arguments fell flat. The judge was looking at her with contempt. Then James took the stand. His lawyer asked him to describe his side of the story. He said he'd been a loving husband and father. He said he'd never hit me. He said he'd never threatened me. He said I was mentally unstable and prone to making things up. Then Patricia cross-examined him. She asked him about specific incidents documented in the notebooks, specific dates, specific things he'd done, and James denied every single one. But then Patricia asked him about the voicemails, the ones we'd played in court. "Are these your voicemails?" she asked, playing them again. James listened to his own voice, his own threats, his own cruelty. "Yes," he finally admitted. "But I was angry. She provoked me. She was keeping my son away from me." "So you threatened to destroy her in court?" Patricia asked. "You threatened to make her regret ever meeting you?" "I was speaking hypothetically," James said. "I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to threaten her?" Patricia interrupted. "You didn't mean to say you'd ruin her? You didn't mean to tell her that you'd take her son away from her?" James's face was red. He was sweating. He was losing control. "I was just angry," he said. "That's all. I didn't mean anything by it." But the judge had heard enough. The judge took a break before delivering her decision. She spent an hour reading through the notebooks again, just reading, taking in the enormity of what was documented there. When she came back, her expression was grim. "I have reviewed all the evidence presented in this case," she said. "I have heard testimony from multiple witnesses. I have reviewed medical records, school records, and a comprehensive psychological evaluation of the child. And I have read through 347 documented incidents of domestic abuse." She looked directly at James. "Based on all of this evidence, it is clear to me that there has been a systematic pattern of abuse in this marriage. It is clear that the respondent, James, has engaged in physical violence, emotional abuse, isolation, and threats. It is clear that he has a history of threatening and intimidating the petitioner, and it is clear that the minor child has been exposed to this abuse and has suffered emotional harm as a result." She paused, and I held my breath. "Therefore," she continued, "it is the judgment of this court that the temporary restraining order is made permanent. James is prohibited from having any contact with Rachel except through her attorney. James is prohibited from having unsupervised visitation with Marcus, pending completion of a comprehensive psychological evaluation and a parenting skills program." She looked at James. "Furthermore," she said, "custody of the minor child, Marcus, is granted to Rachel, with visitation for James to be determined after he completes the court-ordered evaluation and program." If the evaluation shows that he is capable of being a safe and appropriate parent, visitation may be restored, but that will be determined after a future hearing. She banged her gavel. This court finds that the petitioner, Rachel, has provided credible, detailed, and compelling evidence of abuse. Her documentation has been instrumental in this decision. Her testimony has been believable, and her primary concern throughout this process has been the safety and well-being of her son. That is evident in everything she has done. The courtroom was silent. I felt Patricia squeeze my hand. I felt tears streaming down my face. James stood up. His lawyer tried to grab his arm, but he pushed her away. He pointed at me and said, "You think you've won? You think this is over? I'll appeal this. I'll get a new judge. You're out of order," the judge said coldly. "Bailiff, please escort the respondent from the courtroom." As James was being led out, he was yelling about how I'd lied, how I'd fabricated everything, how I was a crazy bitch who was keeping his son from him. I watched him go, and I realized something. He had no power anymore. His words meant nothing. His threats meant nothing. His rage meant nothing, because I had the truth, and the truth had set me free. After the hearing, James appealed, just like he said he would. But the appeal went nowhere. The judge's decision was based on solid evidence, medical records, documentation, testimony, voicemails. There was nothing to appeal. No legal technicalities, no procedural errors, just the truth. James eventually withdrew his appeal. He agreed to attend the parenting program and undergo a psychological evaluation. But that was his choice. I wasn't required to do anything more for him. I'd already done enough. I'd already won. In the months that followed, I rebuilt my life. I went back to work full-time. I reconnected with my mother, who I'd pushed away during my marriage. I reconnected with my friends, who welcomed me back with open arms. I started therapy to deal with the trauma of the abuse. And most importantly, I watched Marcus heal. He still has nightmares sometimes. He still has moments of anxiety. But he's happier now. He's more confident. He's starting to understand that what happened wasn't his fault. That his father's behavior wasn't because of anything he did. He draws pictures now. Before, his drawings were dark. They were full of violence and fear. Now they're bright and colorful. They're pictures of him and me. Pictures of us being safe. Pictures of us being happy. I kept the notebooks. I didn't destroy them. I put them in a safe place, and I show them to Marcus when he's old enough to understand. I tell him, "This is what I did to protect you. This is how I documented the truth so that a judge could see what was really happening. This is how your mother loved you enough to fight for you." Patricia and I stayed in touch. She actually contacted me about a year after the custody hearing. She said she wanted to write a book about my case. She said it was one of the most clear-cut cases of domestic abuse she'd ever seen, but also one of the most successful. Because of the documentation. Because of my bravery in getting out. I agreed to let her use my story, as long as she changed names to protect Marcus's privacy. That book actually helped hundreds of other women who were in abusive relationships, women who didn't think they had any power. Those women read about how I documented my abuse, how I kept detailed records, how those records saved my custody of my son. And they started doing the same thing. They started documenting their own abuse, and many of them were able to get out. Many of them were able to protect their children. I also became an advocate for other women leaving abusive relationships. I started speaking at shelters. I started working with lawyers to help women gather evidence of abuse. I started sharing my story publicly because I realized that my story could help other people. And I learned something important through all of this. I learned that silence is how abusers maintain their power. Silence is how they keep their victims trapped. But documentation is the antidote. Documentation is proof. Documentation is power. If you're watching this and you're in an abusive relationship, I want you to know something. You are not crazy. You are not making it up. You are not overreacting. And you have more power than you think. Start documenting. Start keeping a record. Write down the dates. Write down what happened. Write down what was said. Write down how it made you feel. Keep these records somewhere safe, somewhere he can't find them. Because these records are your evidence. These records are your proof. These records are what's going to save you. I know it's scary. I know it's hard. I know it feels like you're betraying your partner by documenting his behavior, but that's part of the trap of abuse. That's how abusers maintain control, by making you feel like you're the bad guy for protecting yourself. But you're not the bad guy. You're the good guy. You're protecting yourself. You're protecting your children. That's not betrayal. That's survival. I also want you to know that leaving is possible. It's scary. It's uncertain. It's one of the hardest things you'll ever do. But it's possible. I had no job when I left James. I had no money. I had no support system because he'd isolated me from everyone I loved. I thought I had no power. I thought I had nothing. But I had the truth. And I had my documentation. And that was enough. It took months. It took a lawyer. It took going to court. It took fighting. But I won. I kept my custody of Marcus. I kept my son safe. I reclaimed my life. And if I can do it, so can you. I also want to talk about something that doesn't get talked about enough: the impact of abuse on children. Marcus witnessed years of violence and cruelty. He heard me being yelled at. He saw me bruised. He felt the tension and the fear that filled our home. That had an impact on him. It caused him trauma. But the thing that's important to understand is that getting out of that situation was the best gift I could have given him. Removing him from that environment was the most important act of protection I could have done. Sometimes people say, but what about the father's role? Don't children need their parents? And yes, that's true. Children do need their parents. But they need their parents to be safe. They need their parents to be healthy. They need their parents to not abuse them. If a parent is abusive, the most loving thing you can do is protect your child from that parent. And if that requires going to court and fighting for custody, then that's what you do. The irony of my story is that James thought he was going to destroy me in court. He thought he was going to take Marcus away from me. He thought he had all the power. But what he didn't understand is that I had something more powerful than money or connections or a fancy lawyer. I had the truth. I had 347 documented incidents of abuse. I had medical records. I had a broken arm. I had a child who was traumatized by his behavior. I had his own recorded voice threatening me. What did he have? Denial. Lies. A narrative that didn't match the facts. And lies don't hold up in court when you have the truth. My notebooks were the key to everything. Without them, it would have been my word against his word. And in those situations, abusers often win because they're so good at lying. They're so practiced at twisting narratives. They're so skilled at making themselves look like victims. But you can't lie your way around 347 documented incidents. You can't argue with medical records. You can't argue with a child's testimony. You can't argue with your own recorded voice. So here's what I want to leave you with. If you're in an abusive relationship, you have power. You might not feel it right now. You might feel powerless and trapped and afraid. But you have power. You have the power to document what's happening to you. You have the power to tell the truth. You have the power to get help. You have the power to leave. And most importantly, if you have children, you have the power to protect them. You have the power to give them a life free from violence. You have the power to break the cycle. It might take time. It might take courage. It might require going to court and fighting. But it's possible. I'm living proof that it's possible. And years later, when Marcus is grown up and he understands what I went through to protect him, he's going to appreciate it. He's going to understand that my mother loved him enough to fight, to document, to stand up to a man who tried to destroy her. That's a lesson worth teaching your child. That's a legacy worth leaving. You are stronger than you think. You are braver than you believe, and you deserve to be safe. Never forget that.